Good to be together to study the Word of God. We're in the midst of a series that we're calling Turn a Phrase. And we're just looking at some of those statements that Jesus made in his life that maybe were a little unusual or make us think about things. And so I hope you enjoy this series as we work our way through it. Our text for today will come from the book of John, chapter 15, starting in verse 1. And so you can turn there at this time if you would like to, as we study along together. On most Fridays, I go over to a farm and help, and they kind of let me keep a couple pigs there, and so I enjoy that whole process. Anyhow, I'm over there a while back doing some cleaning, went outside to get the wheelbarrow, and when I got it, I noticed that the front tire was going flat, and so I just wheeled it around to be able to put some air in the tire. When I got around there, the gentleman who is there at the farm a lot, who pretty much anything that breaks or anything that I break, that's who you call. And he just pretty much can fix anything, that's around there on the farm. And so anyhow, he's working on another project, but we say hi and he looks over and sees what I'm doing, putting air in the tire. And so I wheel it back around, put it in the barn. Well, outside, it was really cold, like in the 20s. Inside the barn that I went into, because there are baby pigs in there right now, it's probably in the 80-degree range or whatever. So anyhow, it's just sitting in there for a little while, and I'm cleaning everything up and throwing the stuff into the different junk into the wheelbarrow. And as I'm working, all of a sudden there's just this like super loud kind of like explosion, for lack of a better way to describe it. And I really didn't know what it was. And so I went outside to make sure like something outside hadn't happened, or everybody else that was working around there was okay. Everything was fine other than they heard this noise. Anyhow, I go to move the wheelbarrow only to find out that what had happened was the tire on the wheelbarrow had exploded. There was just this like long gash in the side of the tire where it had just blown out. I had no idea it would be that loud, and I really didn't know what had happened. So anyhow, kind of the way my understanding is, it was outside and cold, and when I put air into it, when it got inside and where it was warm, that air just kind of kept expanding or whatever, and eventually it was more pressure than the tire could handle, and it blew itself up. Now, I didn't really know that I could do that or that could happen. My guess is the guy that was over working on the other side, because he's so knowledgeable pretty much about everything, I'm assuming he probably recognized I was probably just putting too much air in there, but he didn't say anything. Now, I think he should have said something, in light of that, to try to keep that problem, because now everything just has to screech to a halt till we get that tire changed and can get back to getting everything cleaned. And I'm not blaming him, because I'm 60-some years old. I should probably know better than to do those kind of things. But it would have been kind of nice if he would have communicated that, hey, here's a tire gauge. It needs to be inflated to about this much, and you can avoid a whole bunch of problems. But anyhow, that conversation, if you will, never happened. Sometimes we do make mistakes, and people watch us make mistakes, and you wonder, if you're a little bit like me, if you should say something to that person as you're watching them do something that doesn't look right, that doesn't look good, that doesn't look safe. But if you're much like I am, I have a tendency just to mind my own business and keep my words and my thoughts pretty much to myself, and so I don't really say anything, though I think sometimes you should. I'm over at the farm, load up a pig to take it to the market. I'm driving down the road. I get a phone call from the guy I work for. Hey, did you know the back gate on the trailer is just flapping in the wind? No, I did not know that. I go, is the pig still in there? And he goes, I have no idea. So I stop, go back, and fortunately the pig was still in there. So I made sure the gate was latched. But I was glad that he called me to let me know, because it avoided what could have become a really big problem, whether the gate hits somebody, hits something, or the pig falls out, or whatever it was. It was great that he called to let me know that I was messing things up. Now, I'm just talking about incidental little things on the farm, but there are times when sometimes like something bigger, something more important is going on. Maybe we're in a hospital and somebody is doing something, and another nurse or a doctor is watching these things unfold, and they're like, that's not right, that's not good, that's dangerous. Now, do you really want them to just stay in their own lane and mind their own business, or do you want them to step in and go, this isn't right, this isn't good, this is important enough that I'm going to say something to you right now, because we don't want to be making mistakes. This is too important, if you will, to get wrong. It's one thing to overflate an entire, it's another thing when somebody's life, if you will, hangs in the balance. When I think about what Jesus says to the people this day, I think some of why he says what he does is because what's going on is just that important. That they need to get these things right to avoid, if you will, a bigger mistake. And so Jesus is going to say something. In the book of John, chapter 15, starting in verse 1, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it will even be more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. Jesus says to those who are listening to him that day, I am the true vine. Now, what prompts Jesus to say that phrase at this point in time? Well, in the book of John chapter 14, Jesus has spent pretty much from our perspective, that entire chapter, talking to the disciples about who he really is in his relationship with God, because there's a fair amount of confusion about who he is. And so I think in light of all this confusion about who he is, Jesus just comes forward and very straightforward says, this is who I am. I am the true vine. There is some clarity about Jesus. But I don't think it's just people in the Bible days who are confused about Jesus. I think there's a lot of confusion about Jesus today. And so let's just explore these words because Jesus wants us to be clear about who he is. I am the true vine. Well, why would Jesus make this point, especially if you will hone in on the word true? Because if you will, there are a lot of vines. Some vines lead to life, and Jesus also says there are some vines that lead to death. And it's important that if you desire to live, that you are connected to the right one. Because again, some are leading to life, and some are leading to death. Well, what was the dominant vine, if you will, of Jesus' day that was probably concerning to him? Well, it was the law. The vast majority of people that Jesus dealt with would have been of Jewish heritage, and they would have held to the idea that they needed to perfectly keep the law. That was the teaching of the religious leaders of that day. And so if you could just perfectly keep the law, you would inherit an eternal life. That's just something that God would have to give to you. But in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we learn something about this mentality or this thought process. Paul writes to the church and says, he has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not to the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And so you had a whole bunch of people who thought if we could just perfectly keep the letter of the law, it would lead to life. But Jesus knew that wasn't something that the vine could afford them. If they had connected themselves to the vine of the letter of the law, it was never going to lead to life. It was always going to lead to death. And Jesus understood that because nobody ever perfectly kept the law. We talked about it recently in another sermon about the idea that you see this played out a lot in the scriptures. They're going to stone a woman who's been caught in adultery. If you have not sinned, cast the first stone. Everybody drops their rocks. Well, why did they do that? Because nobody could keep the law. And there's a lot of stories in the Bible like that. Though they find themselves trying to perfectly keep the law, and they believe if they do, they'll be saved, but nobody could do it. It's a vine that you think leads to life, but it doesn't. It only leads to death. Well, what would be if you will, the dominant worldview today? If in their day, if it was about perfectly keeping the law, but it led to death. What is it that we struggle with in our culture and our world today? Well, as I would kind of look at things, I think for the vast majority of people, what we struggle with is human wisdom versus God's wisdom. In our culture and our world, what we try to tap into that we think is going to lead to life is just our superior knowledge and intellect. If you spend much time on the internet looking at certain things, you will hear people talk about, like they will question God in all kinds of ways. And I'm sure in their mind and in their world, they're just like, well, I just perfectly captured God and his essence, and I understand him and why what he says and what he does is wrong. And so we because I'm so much smarter than God could possibly be, I've created this moral dilemma or trap. Now, that isn't new. That happens all the time in the Bible. The Bible says the religious leaders came to trap Jesus. Well, people still do the same thing today because they are so morally perfect and so intellectually far above things that they can just trap God into all kinds of scenarios. And we also look at things in our culture and our world. And if God knew all those years ago what we know today, then God wouldn't have said some of the things in his word that he does. Like God talks about that he has the ability to love, but if God was really loving, this wouldn't happen, and this wouldn't happen, and this wouldn't happen. So it proves that God can't be all that. And all that we're really talking about at the end of the day is we've fallen into this trap that we are just morally and intellectually superior to God. And we believe that. And it's all around us. But the reality is, it's a vine that people have tapped into that Jesus knows something about. The only place that it can lead is to spiritual death. That's it. And so Jesus wanted to step into our world and just be as honest as he could be with us and say, the only place that you will find the life, the spiritual, everlasting life that you desire is by tapping into me. And it's not just in the secular world, it's in the church as well. Churches are doing all kinds of spiritual contortions about how to embrace and love all forms of depravity and sin to show how loving they are and kind they are and generous they are and to be honest with you, how much bigger they are than the God they claim to worship. And yet reality is when churches do those kind of things, we are just simply attaching ourselves to a vine that can only lead to death. God tells us in his word that he doesn't change, and his word is not going to change, and his word is inerrant. He didn't make a mistake all those years ago when his word was written that it somehow needs to be corrected by us today because we are smarter than he is. We're not. So we simply need to understand that Jesus says, I am the true vine. I am the only source that you can tap into that will lead to life. And then he goes on and he says, my Father is the gardener. It says he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every other branch that does bear fruit, he prunes it so that it will be even more fruitful. Now, that's how that would read in the vast majority of the Bibles that you would be using this morning, whether you're following along in the old-fashioned way with a hard copy or you're on your phone or on your iPad reading that. But there are some tools that are available to us as ministers, available to anybody. And one particular one that I use is just it's the Greek New Testament. And then below it is the words in English so I can read it because I don't read Greek. And so when you read this particular verse, not out of the Bible, but out of that version or the original, and this is how that actually reads. I am the vine, the true, and the Father of me, the farmer is. All branches in me not carrying fruit, he lifts up it. and all the fruit one carrying, he cleans it. The fruit more it might carry. Now, that just reads weird, okay? Because as a general rule, we just don't talk like that in our culture and in our world. But he does point out something that I think is a little bit interesting. So let me just kind of read it again quickly. I am the vine, the true, and the Father of me, the farmer is. All branches in me not carrying fruit, he lifts up it. Now, in the Bible, it actually reads that he prunes that. Now, from our perspective, we would envision that, and if you've ever done much pruning, maybe in your garden or on trees or whatever it is, you just have a branch that's unproductive and you just clip it off and you discard it so that the rest of the plant can be healthy. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But what it says here is, and again, I don't know anything about winemaking or raising grapes or anything like that. I mean, as a kid, I grew up in Johnsville, Ohio, and there were a couple of people who had grape things in their yards. One of them, there was a post down here, and there were probably like 4 or 5 like clotheslines that ran along, and then the grapevines just grew in between that. And in the summer and early spring, like you could see the little clusters starting to form. And by the time fall rolled around, there are just these beautiful clusters of grapes hanging there. And of course, being ornery little city kids, we'd run by and steal some, and then there was another one that was like this big trellis. There were 4 corners and this big, like a canopy thing over top, and the grapes had just overtaken that. Now, the ones up high, at that point in my life, I was too small, I couldn't grab them, but you could get the ones on the side. And again, in the fall of the year, we would steal their grapes, and go by and just do those things, but that's how it worked. Anyhow, this picture, I think some of what is being described here, and this happens in a lot of different ways. Like this branch, it could produce, but not now. It's been beat down by the wind, by the rain, whatever it is. And so the person who's taking care of the grapevine area, arbor, whatever you call it, he might come by and he might see what has happened. And so he will lift it up. And then he will take a piece of plastic or a piece of cloth or something, and he will wrap it up and he will bind it either to the main branch or to one of those cords or to the trellis or whatever it is. And he's just going to kind of watch it over time to see if it will bounce back from the wind that battered it or whatever it was. And a lot of times it will just take off and grow because he didn't cut it off, he lifted it up. Now there's a possibility, if you will, that that's what Jesus is trying to say. Because probably for a few of you who are listening today, that is what has happened to you in your life and in your world. It has just been hard. You have been beat up, pounded against. And it's kind of nice to know, though, that it has been a hard, difficult journey. There could be this loving God who is willing to come alongside you and lift you up and to attach you to support and strength until you have that opportunity to recover and then to begin to grow and, yes, go on and produce fruit. You see, that's what God ultimately desires of us. But he also recognizes that sometimes not everything that we engage in is necessarily beneficial toward the ultimate growth of the goal that God desires for us. And so Jesus does say, God does on occasion go ahead and prune things. And we understand that. I have a garden in our backyard, and every year I plant 2 things. I plant tomatoes and sweet corn because that's pretty much what I enjoy consuming out of the garden. Now, my wife will put some other things in there, and she messes with those, but my end of the garden, that's the 2 things I have. And both of them are susceptible what in the gardening world we call suckers. And there will, like in tomatoes, there will be the main branch growing up, and there will be the main vines going off to the side. And then in that little crease that's created, there will be little things that will grow up. They call them suckers. Now, it's my understanding that they don't actually do anything to produce more fruit. They just basically drain from the plant. And so they tell you, you need to go ahead and remove all those little suckers so that The main plant can be as strong as it can be. The main vines that grow off will be as strong as they can be, and it will produce the most fruit, the largest fruit, and the healthiest fruit. So if you get rid of all the things that are draining the plant, it just makes the fruit and the harvest better. You can do the same thing in sweet corn. If your ground is well fertilized and hardy, the stalk will come up and it'll begin to set the ear, but down low at the ground, it'll have all these little shoots that are coming off. Well, if you want that ear to grow as big and strong and have as many kernels of the great sweet corn as you can get, you need to remove all that stuff. So all that it is doing is growing that ear, not a bunch of stuff that isn't going to produce anything. Well, Jesus says, God looks at our lives sometimes and he says, I love how strong you are. I love how healthy you are. But I want you to produce fruit. And I know some things that are in your life and in your world that aren't helping the fruit to produce. They're a drain, if you will. Now, let me ask you this. If all that's true, and it is, because God in his word says it is, are you wide open as a Christian to allowing God to do what Jesus says he will do, to prune you, to take away things that are just not beneficial toward the harvest that God desires for us to produce? Now, those are, if you will, kind of easy things to talk about, but it can be hard when in reality it begins to show up in our world. That God says, I'm going to say no to that for you because it's not going to help get us where we want to. Are we wide open in our life, faith walk with God to be willing to allow him to do that to us? And then he's going to talk, if you will, about sticks. He says in verse 4, remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. And we know that's true. We're expecting some rough weather here in a few days. And I know this time of year, when the wind blows like that, I'll go outside and there will be a whole bunch of sticks that have just broke off from the tree around the trees in our yard. And so you just go around and you gather them up. And for me, I just throw them in the back of my truck, take them over to the farm, put them in the burn barrel, and we get rid of them. But Jesus says that's the same thing that happens. He says that you do these things so that we might be useful. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like branches that are thrown away and wither. Such branches are picked up, thrown in the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me and my word remains in you, ask whatever you wish and you will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. Well, Jesus says this is what a disciple looks like. They remain in Jesus. They are open to God's pruning to get rid of things that aren't beneficial so that we can produce as much harvest and fruit for the kingdom of God and to blessing people in our world. And I know this, not everybody who hears this is going to agree, but Jesus, notice simply what he says. If you do not remain in me. Now, when I read that doesn't sound like God doing some pruning. That sounds like a decision that you are making. You make this decision. I am just going to step away. I'm going to look for true life in another vine. Well, we've already talked about that. It isn't going to happen. There is only one vine that leads to life. Everything else leads to death. But if you choose to step away from Jesus, understand all that remains for you is to be a stick. You may have the appearance of life and all those kind of things, but you are not connected to the vine. And so someday, he says, all of that will be gathered up and put into a fire to be burned and to be consumed. And so let's not allow ourselves in this thing called life to get lost. Let's understand with great clarity what Jesus is saying to us here. Remain in me and enjoy and experience the glorious hope. And so for those who desire today to remain in Jesus Christ, be open to this, myself included. Be open to God's pruning. In fact, I think we should pray for God to just let us, with great clarity, get rid of the things in our life that aren't helping toward you and your kingdom. Just prune those things away, that I can be as fruitful as I can be, bear as much fruit as I can possibly bear. And for those of you who are listening today who are tempted to walk away because you believe in your heart of hearts, your intellect and your wisdom and your understanding to us, that's where real life is. It's not. And so don't walk away, because there is no life apart from Christ. Let's stay connected to him, because as Jesus told us, I am the true vine.